Greetings, Drumlords, Corbrix here, and this is part 3, the final part of my little playthrough of the Circle of Realms, my massive LEGO wargame that I've got down here in my basement. And this third part's a little bit hectic. There's a lot going on. I even had to print out like this write-up of everything that happened so I can kind of follow along and make sure I don't forget anything or leave anything out. There were a lot of devastating things that would happen to one side, and the other side would be like, aha, we got the upper hand, and then bam, a devastating thing would happen to them. Things just kind of flip-flop back and forth quite a bit. But I'll do my best to give you guys a decent overview of everything that happened on this final phase, and I can reveal who ended up winning once and for all in this conflict. So if you remember last time in part 2, things were not going very well for the Cursed Kingdom and the rebellion. King Mateu had been killed. Roscius Matres, the leader of the rebellion, had also been killed. They had managed to summon their giant eagle Vernicus, only for that to be killed as well. And at the very end, I had played my Scepter of the Titans, sending a solar flare over here to Maria, which would very handily immobilize both the rebels and the kingdom units, which is great because Anacrea is not affected by a solar flare because they have fire resistance, and they give their allies fire resistance too. So all of my raider units were also immune to the solar flare. But it wasn't all rainbows and roses for me and Anacrea. My very capable hero Bertnoth had been lured into a devastating trap and absolutely murdered by King Jalen. As for the leader of Anacrea, Sepheth, well, he had been killed now 2 times, and he only has 3 forms. I say only, but 3 is quite a bit. And so if Sepheth dies one more time, Anacrea is really going to be in trouble. And the entire raiding party that was sent here by me had more or less been wiped out, and I had to burn my ship down so that I could come back with a bigger, stronger raiding party for the final phase. But there were problems with that too. A lot of my raiders have been captured by the rebels, and so I wasn't able to really return at full force, not at the strength that I really wanted to be. So let's see how all of this unfolded. Well, first off, everyone has 5 rounds to get ready for that solar flare. And the first thing the rebels did was they started to research the dragon contract. This recruits one of their strongest heroes, Roscius Matres' brother, Nex Matres, to the rebellion. And he comes with his dragon mercenary soldiers and a ship, the rebel blockade runner, which the rebels can use to relocate their people outside of Maria so that they can survive the solar flare. Meanwhile, I was rallying my troops and coming back on my bigger ship. I believe the 3rd ship is called the Sea Raven, which looks a lot like this whale scar over here, except it's got a sail added on. I probably have a picture of it, so I'll just plop that up. And Anacrea, meanwhile, has already built the spider barge, and they are loading up forces onto that barge to come in for what we believe is the final invasion that will wipe out the kingdom and the rebellion once and for all. This is a large attack force, and it's coming with capable heroes to lead it. We're talking Lord Sepheth the Lich Lord in his final phase, Bovric the Bull, Crame the Bat, and Corzin the Snake. So this is a very large attack force coming over to attack the rebels in the kingdom. The kingdom, quite frankly, has only gotten about half of its heroes out onto the playing field in the first place. And the rebels, while more advanced, have lost quite a few units and are taking quite a beating from these repeated raids coming their way. So what does everyone do while we're waiting for this solar flare to arrive? Well, me and Anacrea, we're getting our forces together and we are coming over. Meanwhile, the kingdom is very frantically running people out of Maria and over into Legna, into the snow, where they will not be hit by the solar flare. The rebels, on the other hand, are actually building up at this time. They've got to rebuild that command center that I blew up at the end of the second playthrough, and so they start to rebuild their command center, this time next to their other buildings at the sea. They're going to be a much tougher nut to crack when our forces end up arriving. The rebels also take anyone they don't want to lose, and they throw them onto that blockade runner, and they sail out away from Maria, where they will be safe. Everyone's had some time to prepare, to mobilize. The 5 rounds come to an end, and the solar flare actually begins. And this is when the violence starts. Now, my raid ship arrives at the coast. I'm getting deja vu all over again. It's just like my first attack against the rebels. Except this time, the rebels have a wall, they're a little bit more fortified, and I've got a bigger ship, and I've got a solar flare on my side. And so, while the place is affected by this solar flare, the rebel units basically have to stand still and wait for my men to come to them. During this time, I do several things. My raiders go around and they kill off the rebel peasants. We're raiders, we're not above murdering peasants, especially if that means the rebels can't build their buildings again. And of course, if we're killing off the peasants, that means we have to kill off the most glorified peasant of all. I am talking, of course, about Whiskey Steve, Lord Lawrence Stevenson. Now that Roscius is dead, Whiskey Steve is the only leader that the rebels have. He's the only one that's giving the rebels the ability to convert units still, and that is critical. That means that once he is gone, The rebels are going to a very, very bad place. But I know Whiskey Steve still has a lot of health, and I would like a heavy hitter to take him out. And so what do I do? Well, remember how I mentioned there are neutral buildings scattered throughout the Circle of Realms. Well, one of the neutral buildings that is next to where the rebel buildings were all built is the Temple of the Waters. This is like a Greek-style temple that I built using like old X-Wing parts that I wasn't ever going to use again. And this is a temple where you can resurrect fallen heroes. Now, resurrection in Circle of Realms is never a cheap thing. It's very expensive. I believe the first hero that you resurrect costs 1,000 extra gold pieces to resurrect, and the price just goes up from there, which is just ludicrous. You don't really have that kind of spending power. Eventually, you just stop having the ability to resurrect heroes. And honestly, it was a little bit tough for me to scrape together the 1,000 gold that I needed to resurrect Burtonoff. I had to have my berserkers raiding the rebel watermill and stealing gems from them for me to be able to even really afford all of this. And even then, I barely scraped together enough. But once I did, you know exactly what I did. I resurrected Burtonoff, my fallen champion, who maybe wasn't quite the brightest guy, but still a very strong, a very heavy hitter. Brought him back to life, rushed him over to Whiskey Steve, who was literally huddling in a room with potions, trying to keep himself alive from the solar flare. And we just wailed on the guy. And poor Lawrence Stevenson didn't stand a chance. This brought some of the rebel buildings under my control, not the new command center that they had rebuilt, but everything else I had squarely and easily secured from the rebels. And I was now poised to attack the remaining rebel forces. I think I had even liberated like a couple of my units who had been captured and were imprisoned in those rebel walls. By the time all of this had wrapped up, the Anacreons were just now arriving in their Scorpion barge, and it is very unfortunate, but the solar flare was coming to an end at that time. And the rebels have been doing some other schemy things off on the sidelines. Remember that rebel blockade runner that left Mario when the solar flare started? Now he had gone all the way over to the far side of Legna and recruited some Legnan monks from the monastery. Monks are pretty strong units, especially the sensei. There are two elite monks basically called sensei, and they've got an ability to ignore either armor or defense with their attacks. And typically in the Circle of Realms, if you've got ways to get around armor and defense, those are huge. So not only had he recruited these units, but he even gave a blunderbuss to one of the sensei. So this guy was locked and loaded, ready to shoot our poor raiders and Anacreons who were just there to raid and pillage and, erase them from the face of the earth. And when the solar flare ended, this blockade runner was right on its way back to Maria. And really, it felt like everyone arrived at the same time. The blockade runner came in from the north. The sensei had gotten out and climbed to the top of this little ruined castle and used that as a good vantage point to rain down on everybody with a height advantage. Meanwhile, the Anacreon barge had just pulled up at the coast and lowered its drawbridge, letting out a myriad of units. We're talking vampires, shadow knights, shadow conscripts, mercenary units, and 3 very powerful heroes onto the battlefield. And like any climactic end to a game should be, an epic battle ensued. We had the kingdom units crawling out of their castle to meet the Anacreons on the battlefield. We had these monks and other rebel units banding together and attacking from different angles as well. Meanwhile, all of the Anacreons were charging off of the barge, and my raider units were continuing their assault on the rebel command center. It was wild. Now, Setheth got off the boat, and we all are afraid of Setheth at this point. Lord Setheth the Lich Lord doesn't have the best armor in the world, but he hits very, very hard. His Sword of Death is upgraded to, God, what is it called? I think it's called the Sword of Eternal Torment or something like that. I don't know. It's something pretty extreme and hardcore. And so he's leading the charge into battle. But there's a critical flaw with relying on any one unit for all of your heavy lifting, and that is that unit can still be easily targeted down, no matter how strong they are. Especially when you've got a monk with a blunderbuss standing at a height advantage, and that monk just shot at Setheth repeatedly. It got to the point where Setheth was actually trying to run out of range of the monk, trying to get away from that monk with the height advantage. But Setheth got so injured in that process that, quite frankly, we didn't feel comfortable committing him to any part of the battle after that point. Now, just like relying on Setheth is not the best strategy in the world, relying on that monk also has its problems. Now, the real hard part about getting that monk is he's up so high and people have to climb up the ladder to get to him, which is very tricky to do. Unless, of course, you have wings, like Crame the Bat does. Captain Crame the Bat is a very scary Anacreon hero. He's got a fire whip. He can fly into the sky, just like dragons and other flying units can in the Circle of Realms. And he's very good at torturing units. Now, Obviously, he's not torturing out here on the battlefield, but what he did do was he took off the ground, flew over to the top of the tower, and landed right next to that monk and just eviscerated him with his flaming whip. Meanwhile, the rebels send their Dragon Company mercenaries in to attack, and while they do some devastating damage at first, the vampires and the Varaka swoop in and they pick them apart. Let's see, what else happens on the battlefield? Well, the rebels ran Nex Matres right up into the Anacrean horde, which Anacrea saw as a golden opportunity, because Anacrea also had a very situational, unlockable card that essentially required killing Nex Matres with either Captain Crame or Captain Corzan. And so the two charge in to attack Nex. But Nex has the backup of King Jalen and other kingdom forces at his side, and so they end up getting into this heated clash, and Nex Matres in the twist actually kills Captain Corzan and not the other way around, which ended up being quite devastating because it allowed the rebels to draw a tier 3 reward card because they had a quest to kill Captain Corzan. Now, back at our larger battle, ultimately, King Jalen, after putting up a valiant effort, is overwhelmed by the horde, and he is killed off. So even though the rebels have come back into the game, the Cusk Kingdom has lost their final leader. They are not advancing tech ages anymore, and they no longer get any of their bonuses. Meanwhile, Captain Nex Matres runs away, the little coward that he is, as the rebels begin to regroup and try to take their base back. Beartnoth and his raiders manage to slaughter everyone over at the rebel base except those standing on the command center. They get caught at a very narrow choke point. There's a point on the command center that is just a single stairwell up, and basically the rebels had managed to fortify that one position, and Beartnoth and his men are not able to kind of beat through quickly enough to take over that building. Beartnoth and his men basically have to kill one unit at a time to advance up that building, and it is rough, especially when basically all raider units are melee units. They don't have a way to line up outside and just pick off units with range. They have to run in, and they can only kill what they can attack in melee, which means a narrow choke point, like a single stairwell, means I'm only doing one attack at a time as I work my way up that command center. And it's pretty horrible because the rebels have their woodsmen up the top who are ranged units. They're raining down on any raiders that expose themselves, to the point where I needed to replenish and replace a lot of my fallen troops. Now, fortunately, since Dragon Company was being slaughtered by the vampires, I was able to recruit those Dragon Company units because I had taken over the building that actually trains them, the Crestwood Keep. And so I was able to replenish my forces in a way to kind of keep pressure up on that attack. I felt very confident that it'd be only a matter of time until we pulled off the victory here. But then the unthinkable happened. I'm trying to remember exactly when it happened or why it happened. I think it was when the rebels had killed Sethith. They had a tier 3 quest card to kill him, and so when they did kill him, they managed to secure a tier 3 reward. Now, there's a variety of tier 3 rewards. Some of them are potions that like transform one of your units into a T-Rex or something that can just chomp on everybody, like getting a free unlockable for like 30 rounds. There are others that allow you to actually take control of witches and other neutral units on the battleground and have them join your cause temporarily. And then there's one other one that, quite frankly, after this game, I'm thinking about removing. It's just an annoying card after playing a game this long. And this card is called the Way of the Phoenix. And what Way of the Phoenix allows you to do is it allows you to go to your starting position, which is over here for the rebels. And it allows you to place all of your starting units back onto the field, in addition to, I think, 2 non-hero units as well. The original intent was, of course, if someone gets completely wiped out, they could potentially come back into the game. That being said, I think we can all agree that my game is long enough without having people have a magical comeback right in the middle of it. As you can tell, I'm not salty at all about this happening, by the way. But basically, with that card being played, Roskius came back into play, Whiskey Steve came back into play, all the peasants that were not in jail came back into play. And I think they brought a battering ram in and a catapult in as well, because they realized that they were going to start to need to destroy the buildings that I had taken over from them. This was super frustrating from my perspective and from the perspective of Anacrea. We were really enjoying the fact that the rebels could capture units and they could execute them, but they couldn't actually convert them to their side anymore. Well, with Roskius and Whiskey Steve back on the field, that completely changed. And suddenly, it was me and Anacrea who felt the pressure was on. At this point, the kingdom is starved for cash. They've got no money, they've got nothing at their disposal, and so they opt to do what is essentially your last major action you do in the Circle of Realms. They chose to disband their faction. Disbanding is basically a way of saying, Look, my team is no longer a superpower anymore. The kingdom ceases to be its own fully functional team. The player still gets turns, but the kingdom player can no longer build new buildings, they can't advance tech ages, they can't research any technologies, and the buildings that they do have become neutral buildings, which means that they can't be destroyed by enemy players, but they also require a unit on them at all times in order for them to function. If the kingdom player moves their units off of those buildings, just like any other neutral building, they become neutral again and no one has any control over them. So that's a lot of disadvantages to being disbanded, but there are some perks too. You basically become the ultimate parasite, which for the kingdom was particularly important because it meant that the kingdom player could use the rebel player's money instead of just using their own money. And the kingdom was broke, and so they were now able to leverage the treasury of the rebels to buy the rest of the units that they could make. This allowed them to get their wolf knights onto their field, insert Ernest Belvedere onto the field, and stay competitive in this final push. Meanwhile, all of our attention, Anacria and the Raiders, turn all of their focus onto this rebel command center. It basically becomes a do or die effort to destroy that command center so that the rebels cannot rebuild and are not able to capture anyone. Because whether they can convert people or not, if the rebels have no prison, they are effectively shut down because their code of ethics forbids them from killing units on the battlefield. They have to capture them and they have to put them to trial. If they've got no prisons, then that's over. Of course, while we're making this mad dash over to the command center, Ernest Belvedere and his 2 wolf knights are hacking down and slaughtering the non-heroes in the Anacrian army. Basically, anyone and everyone that's vulnerable as we turn all of our attention to this command center starts to get killed. And it's quite frankly because we just did not have the turns and the attention to devote to them. We were just allowing these units to kill us because we had bigger fish to fry. Every turn we stopped to attack Belvedere or his wolf knights was a turn that we could not spend attacking and trying to take over the command center. As we're doing this, the Anacrian forces build a war catapult so that we can attack the command center more effectively. After a certain point, we really reach the conclusion that the choke point is just too difficult to get up, especially with all those forces there. This building needs to be destroyed. And of course, as if fortune were smiling or frowning, I'm not really sure, looking upon us in a very interesting way, when the time comes for us to draw an environmental card for the region of Maria again, this time we draw an earthquake. Now an earthquake, like a solar flare, is a catastrophe, so it gets a 5-round buffer period for everyone to get ready. But once that earthquake would come through, we would see severe damage hitting all of the buildings in Maria. Any building without anyone to repair it on it would be destroyed for sure, and this more or less meant that the command center would fall too. But if the rebels and the kingdom were able to get enough builders together, they could rebuild it. Plus, at this stage in the game, 5 rounds might as well be an eternity. And so Setheth leads the charge to attack the command center. He is, as we stated, injured, but he can use his mystical sword of death, or whatever it is I call it, to vaporize units from behind Bertanoth as we kind of claw our way up the command center. I, for my part, take my other hero who is out right now, and that's Ethelu. Ethelu, the tribal priestess, has the ability to shapeshift into different animals on the battlefield, and so I used her ability to shapeshift her into her rhinophant form, which is basically like an elephant and a rhino had a baby. It's a giant beast, taken I think from some Harry Potter Magical Beast, Mystical Beast set that I got a long time ago. And the rhinophant is quite capable at damaging buildings, and so I charge it in to attack the command center. As we're doing this, Heroscape is making a mad dash to get over there as well. You know what he's gonna do. He's gonna use his signal flare when he gets there. And we had kind of prepared for that. We were like, it's whatever, we'll deal with it. We'll just try to manage it all. What we weren't prepared for was a reward card. So remember when the rebels had drawn a tier 3 reward for killing Corzan? Well, it turns out that they drew what would essentially be the perfect card in this situation. If you look over here, there is a kind of tree-like witch's hut. And that is where Aina of the swamp is. Aina is a witch and a quest giver. And of course, the tier 3 reward that the rebels drew was to take control of Aina, bring her onto the battlefield. This is so obnoxious because Aina is basically right there. She basically comes right into the middle of the battle. Aina's a really cool witch. She's basically all about plants and stuff. So her primary attack is a spell where she has plants help her out and attack whatever target she's attacking. And it does different things depending on the terrain that someone's standing on. So if someone's standing on a building, for example, then houseplants will attack them. And I think they deal blunt damage because they hurl their pots at them. But if they're attacking someone on grass, it's some sort of a vine attack, dirt does something different, and so on and so forth. So as she starts to attack Setheth, Roscius fires up his signal flare, summons over the remaining rebels who have been scattered in different places across the Circle of Realms, trying to get away from these solar flares and other things. And together, they all attack Sepith. Aina uses her magic to attack Sepith with barbed vines, bringing him dangerously close to death. Things are looking ugly for the Lord of Darkness. And so Sepith takes off in kind of a cowardly retreat, running back to the Crestwood Keep, the castle that I had taken over, right next to the Rebel Command Center. Meanwhile, Anacreon and Raider forces are picking off the other Rebel units that Roscius could summon closer to Sepith. We had effectively cut off these Rebel units from being able to get to Sepith and deal damage to him. But for some reason, we completely forgot about Roscius himself, and the fact that the little flare he's firing is also a fully functional gun. And so Roscius, the rebel hero, runs in after already having been killed once before and shoots Sepith square in the eyes, kills the Dark Lord, and really throws Anacrea into chaos. All we can do now at this point is throw everything we have at the command center. We at least want to get this thing taken down. And so Othello is attacking it in Rhinofin form. Our Anacrean catapult has gotten right up in front of it as well. And to finish off those pesky rebels that are shooting from the top, Crame the Bat swoops in from above and murders them with his flaming whip. At last, the earthquake comes into play and collapses the command center, bringing it to the ground. And what happens next? Well, my friends had to go home. I don't know if you caught it, but in the very beginning I said my friends came in from out of town, and quite frankly, when the weekend came to a close, they all had to leave. And they left at a time when it wasn't 100% clear who had won this battle. Now, there was, in theory, a way for us to determine the winner when a game ends prematurely. It's kind of wonky and very excessive. You would basically take all the units you've got on the battlefield and divide them by the units you could potentially have on the battlefield. The calculation's a little bit complicated, it's boring, it doesn't really take into consideration a team's actual potential to win a game. But I did run that calculation. And so after looking over and seeing who still had more forces on the battlefield and what their final calculation was, I can reveal a winner according to those rules. And that winner was the Cusp Kingdom and the Rebellion. Despite everything that the Raiders and the Anacreons had thrown at them, we just didn't have much left to throw. Especially when you consider the fact that I didn't even have a base. I was just throwing raiders in from my raid ships. I didn't have a place to go back to. I didn't have any buildings on the battlefield that I could claim as mine. And so I definitely was bringing down my team for that calculation. And I mean, sure, Anacrea could rebuild their forces. So too could the rebels, though. There was a lot at this point hinging on what the outcome of this battle over here would be. And we just didn't quite get to the end of it by the time everyone had to go home. And it's true, my buddy could come back out and we could finish this game off if we really wanted to. But truth be told, there's no way I'm convincing the guy who was playing as the Cusp Kingdom to come back out to continue to struggle for his existence as the kingdom. And I quite frankly was getting tired at the tenacity of the rebel player. And this guy just would not quit. And so we had to call it there. Now I know it's a bit of a disappointing conclusion to this playthrough, and I agree with you. And so I will be putting out some videos coming up over some rule changes that I decided to implement to the game after this. Very clearly and very obviously, and most importantly, I think that beating other players into submission worked very well when me and my friends were younger, and we had a lot more time to get together and play games like this. But after being older, with some of my friends coming from out of town to play this game, and quite frankly, after playing more games, more modern games with kind of tighter designs, I think there has to be a very clear sort of victory point system, some sort of a way where we can see who is winning the game at any given time. If we were to stop a game at any moment, we could immediately go, oh, that person is the winner, they are in the lead. And so I've been devising a system to be implemented into the game for that. And I'll be sharing that in one of my next few videos, so make sure you're subscribed to see what that is. But I'll also be sharing some other rule changes I've come up with. There were, of course, numerous things that came up in the game where I was like, well, I'm not really sure how I feel about this, and some balancing tweaks that have to be done to the factions themselves. But I'll get to those in another video. So make sure you're subscribed so you can see that content. And after playing my next game, maybe I'll make another playthrough of it, maybe I won't. And let me know in the comments below what you thought of this playthrough. Was it interesting to you? You got to part 3, so you probably found it at least reasonably interesting. Would you like to see more playthrough videos in the future or my next few games that I play? Or are you really hungry for me to get all the units out into different videos so you can see and break down what the different teams have to offer? Just let me know and I'll do my best to, live up to what you guys want to see. Other than that, my friends, be happy, be healthy, be well, and I'll see you next time here in the Circle of Realms.